Got it? Are you looking at the screen?
Yep.
I'm looking at a map.
Yeah.
You should be looking at a map. Excellent. Okay, so thank you. Oh, somebody's coming in. I'll just let them in.
Okay. Yeah. I gave you another job, so.
That's right. That's okay. It keeps me busy. It keeps me out of trouble. So I'm so delighted to be back with you all in this virtual setting. I really enjoyed coming up to Duffield whenever that was that I spoke with you all before. I'm Kimberly Redding, and I teach history, mostly modern European history, modern German history at Carroll University. I also teach some cross-cultural classes that in a typical year will take students to Germany, or the other one I teach is Jewish American culture, and so we explore Jewish American communities in Milwaukee and Chicago. Obviously, neither of those classes is traveling this spring or this fall, so we've been doing a lot virtually, and this is just sort of an extension of that. What I'd like to do this morning is kind of give you a sense of the different varieties of immigrant experiences for people coming from what today we would call Germany. And if you can hopefully see the map on the screen, you can see all these different colors and different entities ranging from the Austrian Empire, Bavaria, Brandenburg, Posen, West Prussia, Pomerania, all of these different lands, now part of Germany. And up until the middle of the 19th century, so the middle of the 1800s, these were, for the most part, separate kingdoms, one sort or another. So if you have ancestors that came from this part of the world, they might not have identified themselves as German. They would likely have identified themselves as Silesian or Prussian or Pomeranian. And if you've been to any of those parts of the world, you know that they kind of speak the same language. Some very strong dialects. I can't even do the Swabian dialect, which is one of the famous ones, but from up around Berlin, it's a very hard dialect. So instead of the German ich komme, they would say ich komme. Ich is a very typical from the Berlin region. So we call all these people today Germans. They share this common geographical basis, but they wouldn't necessarily have called themselves German. And so,
I'm not sure where she's talking.
and I mean all of these regions, but the historian in me has to tell you that my ancestors would not have called themselves Germans. They would have called themselves something else based on their regional identity. So that's just kind of introduction. I'm going to use the word German, but just know that that's a word that we're kind of imposing backwards on people. I just clicked to a new slide. Hopefully you could see it. Philip asked me if I have any direct connection to this history. Absolutely, I do. The oldest connection, and I was just talking to my mother about this actually last week. So on my mother's side of the family, her middle name before she got married was Faust. Can't get much more German than that. And there was a spelling change there between Faust and Faust, which made the genealogy kind of interesting for her when she was tracing it. What I grew up knowing was that there were Fausts in the United States from the 1740s. And the reason I knew that is because my grandmother, who was a Faust, she was a member of the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. And one of her great dreams was that one of her granddaughters would join this organization. None of us have, but so we know that that branch of the family came from, you can see the blue arrow, from Hesse. The Peter Faust was the oldest name that she had traced back to, and of course there are a million Peter Fausts. The names get carried down, but they are documented as coming into the port of Philadelphia and living for a time in Pennsylvania, and then moving down to Alamance County, North Carolina, and also Eastern Tennessee. We always went on family vacation. It seemed like everybody in the town was some kind of kissing cousin. Lots and lots of Fausts and the families that married into the Fausts. So the tombstone looking there at is Samuel Faust. And that was one of the older tombstones that we found in Eastern Tennessee. There's a Faust cemetery outside of, I think it's Kingsport, a little town in Eastern Tennessee. So that's that side of the family. And so the Fausts represent kind of the first group of people I'm going to try and talk about today. Are these early immigrants to the United States in the 1700s. Father's side of the family, that's the small side. That group represents a much later wave of immigration in the 1880s. So almost 150 years later, that branch of the family comes from Baden-Württemberg, a little further to the south, the area around Stuttgart. And there we did actually connect with people we know are cousins back in Germany. And when I was an exchange student back in my, naive, lacking in social wisdom days, I went to the University of Stuttgart and marched up to Professor Karl Kussmaul's office and just knocked on the door and said, "Hey, I'm here, your American cousin." And he was very, very kind and had his secretary deal with me, and I ended up in the little town of Böblingen and also Reutlingen, and was overnight in an inn and fed dinner and watched old movies with this little old lady who was a cousin of Dr. Karl Kussmaul. And she happened to know the Ritter family of Ritter Sport chocolate, is from that area. So when she sent me on my way, it was with bags of free samples from Ritter. So it was a delightful little interlude. And this branch of the family, we spell it in this country Kussmaul. A lot of the German branch spells it with that funky umlaut thing, not umlaut, sz. That branch of the family, as I said, came over much later in the 1880s and pretty much went straight to Michigan, around Saginaw, and there are all kinds of Kussmauls in Michigan. There's also a Kussmaul seed company, which somebody gave me the baseball cap of if I want to claim that heritage. And those seeds are sowed all over the Midwest, various kinds of grains and stuff. So these are kind of two typical examples of the two periods I want to talk about today. Can you hear me okay, everybody?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. The pre-1800 period, this early period, where most immigration came through really Philadelphia, sometimes Boston, sometimes New York. Philadelphia was a huge port at this time, and then this later wave of immigration. And I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but I think you can bear with me. See if I can. Okay.
Wow.
So prior to 1800, obviously we know less about who and why people would come from these German-speaking lands. We know less for a couple reasons. There were far fewer records kept. Many of these records that were kept, just because of time, were lost, burned to the ground in one of multiple wars, or just gone into some obscure archive, because now the Lubeck City Archive is considered a small, obscure archive. In the 1700s, the city of Lubeck, northern Germany, was one of the most powerful trade in Central Europe. And so that was one place that had a ton of ships coming in and out all the time. And that was a major debarkation point for immigrants. The other major port was Rotterdam. And that is a sketch / painting colored in of Rotterdam in, I think it's about 1750, maybe 1740. And I think I have the artist come future slide. So, you know, if you look at that, you think, oh, gee, that looks like the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Yes.
Are those actually the ships that came across the Atlantic?
Some of the larger ones, yeah. So I don't know if you can see the cursor, but like these over here,
Yes.
yeah, not these. These are river ships,
But I meant
but
those
some
other-
of the bigger ones, yeah.
And that's all the bigger they were, or do they just look smaller to me? I mean, they don't look that large.
Well, so they weren't necessarily that large.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, you know, like, okay, you know, maybe I'll go out on one of those for an hour or two on Lake Michigan, but don't put me in the Atlantic. So that level of risk, you kind of have to keep in mind, right? For my Faust ancestors, or perhaps some of your ancestors, to say, yeah, you know, things are unfortunate enough, or I am adventure seeking enough that I'm gonna basically walk from Hesse, Marburg, Frankfurt area. I'm gonna walk from there to Rotterdam. And then I'm gonna throw fate to the wind and get on one of these boats. No radio, no GPS, no Coast Guard, right?
Nothing.
Nothing. That takes a fair bit of courage, right? Fair bit of gumption, chutzpah. And so why would people do this? Obviously, a whole variety of reasons. One of the big ones was that during this time period, so 1600s through the 1700s, Europe was in what some people call a little ice age. So a cooling trend in sort of climactic shifts, and that cooling trend in Central Europe meant that harvests were not as good, not as plentiful. When harvests are down, the rent that one owes in kind to the state or to the lord of the manor, the rent doesn't necessarily go down. So this long-term drop in the climate and drop in harvest, it causes all kinds of underlying tensions in European society. Illness goes up, the birth rate goes down, marriage age gets later. There are all kinds of shifts that come from this couple 100-year period of cooler weather as this sort of underlying tension that might be enough generation after generation to make someone think, I need to go somewhere else. A bigger, more obvious cause was something called the 30 Years' War. Some historians call one of the first world wars. It wasn't global per se, but it certainly ranged across Europe for a period of, as the name says, about 30 years. And what happens in this time period in times of war? Well, sometimes men get called up into service. Definitely, war battles are fought on farmland. Definitely, cities are put under siege. And all of those things are bad for survival for regular folks, right? And even for wealthier folks. Those are bad. And a 30-year conflict that combines political motives and religious motives this new sect called Protestantism or Lutheranism, right? This kind of conflict can make people feel like, oh man, Europe is about to implode, right? What I thought I knew as stability is no longer there. I want to be left alone. So that's another reason. And then a third reason that wealthier people would try and leave to escape, usually to buy themselves out of their feudal obligations, which is an economic thing. Feudalism is this really complicated economic system that basically ties you personally to the person above you in the economic ladder. That person above you in the economic ladder says, I will give you some sort of protection from whoever the bad guys are at the moment. In exchange, you will give me your first fruits of everything. Of fruits, of grains, of animals, sometimes of as well. And this is an inherited system generally. One could, if one saved up, they could buy themselves out. And so if you imagine, during the 1700s, this is when a lot of Europeans are coming to the Americas to settle. And the reason that we're taught in the history books is religious freedom, economic freedom. And that's 30 Years' War and escaping these economic ties that tie you in. With me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
The how is the other part that may turn you off from migrating at this point in time. As I said, if you were coming from the area around Frankfurt, you would probably be walking, maybe pushing a cart, possibly with a wagon to the port of Rotterdam. And that walking kind of journey, you had to figure 2 to 3 weeks. If any of you have ancestors from Brandenburg, what is today Poland, Estonia, Silesia, Pomerania, those regions probably would have left through Lubeck, which is closer, shorter distance getting to port. But then at the port, that's an X for the unknown. There weren't really regularly scheduled shipping lines, right? When the boat was ready and the captain had enough money to stock up the beer, they would go, unless it was the wrong time of year. So it was never clear how long it would be waiting portside.
What do you mean by the wrong time of year?
Well, you generally wanted to try and avoid hurricane season, but also on the European side, the winter, what do you call the storms that blow in the winter in Europe? Those big winter gales. There's a name for them.
That's a nor'easters.
Like the nor'easters, yeah. That,
Okay, didn't I know
yeah.
that?
So you kind of want to avoid hurricane season on this side of the Atlantic, and also these nor'easters on that side of the Atlantic, right? So, and if you're planning an 8 to 10 week journey, there's not a giant window there for sailing. So there's a lot of unknowns just at the port. And in the 1700s, just getting to the port was like the journey of a lifetime. Vast majority of people, unless they were kings, princes, queens, the majority of people spent their entire life with a circle of maybe 20 miles around their home. So, talk about fear of the unknown. This is a major undertaking. And so partly for that reason, this is on the right-hand side of the screen, who would be able to do this? First and foremost, people with skills that they could carry in a suitcase. So carpentry skills, stonemasons. You can put your tools in a bag, throw the bag over your shoulder, a pair of pants, and you're good to go, right? It's much harder to travel with a pair of oxen. It's less portable. And as a skilled craftsman, or even a journeyman craftsman in training, that however long you're stuck in Rotterdam, you're going to be able to survive, because there are going to be people there that need carpentry done, that need someone to set up the type in their publishing shop, in their printer's shop. So you have these transportable, marketable skills. Brewers, everybody needs beer. especially when the water isn't necessarily clean. Right, so these are the groups that were actually more likely to be able to migrate because they had a transportable skill. More prosperous farmers could migrate because they had some kind of financial reserve. They could turn their farm into cash, but much more likely these were craftspeople and sometimes their families. There's a little bit of, and this is where we get the fairy tales, there's a little bit of the second son who's not going to inherit anything goes off to seek their fortune. There's a little bit of that in here too. Or possibly the third or fourth son. So the first son would likely inherit the land. The second son would probably go into the ministry or law, maybe both. The third son would oftentimes be sent out on their way, kind of as a generality. And for these people who couldn't pay their way, like these third sons, paid for the trip by indenturing themselves. Somebody else, maybe a plantation owner, maybe a rich Philadelphian, maybe a ship owner who's willing to take a risk, they pay your way ahead of time. You, the traveler, pay that back through work over a period of 7 to 10 years.
That's how my neighbor got here.
Oh, really?
Yes, she was indentured to somebody who was at St. John's Military Academy. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Do you know when that was? Sounds like it was much later.
It would have been the late 1800s.
Yep. Yeah.
Did that, yeah. Yeah, that's how she
Yeah.
That was, I wish I'd taught, I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, I wish I would have gotten more about it. But that's how she got here.
It's always like that, isn't it? Yeah. So that's the pre-1800 part. And I'll stop and take a breath there in case there are other comments or questions. We know a lot more about 19th century immigration. This earlier period is a little rougher.
Yeah, I just don't see how they could have had, I mean, to get the money to after, if they were poor, they just bought themselves out of being a feudal or serfdom. Where else would they get the money to be able to, because it had to cost quite a bit of money to cross the ocean, right? Or not?
Right. I mean, if they were not relatively well off, they couldn't go. They couldn't go. And so you see this kind of self-selection. And these are the peoples that become part of that sort of Benjamin Franklin generation of, they would have called themselves libertarians,
right,
wanting self-government, because they had very clear memories of feudalism, of being trapped to the land, maybe of having to work off their passage to the Americas. And they want something different. They tended also to be Lutheran, so Protestant, more than Catholic. And what I don't know, because the record keeping was really pretty bad, is what percentage of people on these ships died en route. Generally speaking, they were expected to bring their own provisions. It's sounding bleaker and bleaker. Uh, if you were lucky, maybe you had some primitive kind of granola bar, but basically, kind of a hardtack kind of thing. And the ship usually provided beer,
Oh,
which everybody drank. Beer wasn't going to go bad.
well, and there's nutrition there.
Well, there you go. And there's some nutrition there. Yeah. And a lot of the beer was actually weaker than what we think of as good German beer. And the point was really to provide hydration that was safe. But yeah, a lot of risk at this time, a huge amount of risk. Okay, let's go on. Okay. I don't know if I can make this graph be bigger for you. Is that bigger? Whoa.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
There we go.
Okay.
So in the 1800s, 19th century, we have a lot better records on both sides of the Atlantic. And so we know a lot more about what pushed people out of the motherland or the fatherland and what pulled them into the United States. Record keeping got a lot better. And so if you go online and just Google German immigration to the United States, you'll come up with one of the countless variations of this graph, which shows you, so on the axis going up, it's counting roughly numbers of people who were identified as Germanic immigrants to the United States. And then along the bottom, you can see years ranging from 1820 to 1980. I think 1980, yeah. Why 1820? Because there was something else going on for the first 20 years of the 19th century, and that was the Napoleonic Wars. And that unrest in Europe. So there wasn't a whole lot of immigration during that period of warfare. But what I've circled on this graph, 5 red circles,
Right.
show you, I think you can see those, right?
Right.
Yeah, that show you where things kind of peaked, where there were big jumps. And this is so cool to me because you can line up history that you would learn in a textbook with people moving. We can very clearly see in these 5 moments that something is happening.
What happened with the big circle?
So let me go from early to late,
Okay.
and I'll get to the big circle. So that the first circle, there's a circle right around the late 1840s and early 1850s. Middle of the century, if you have Irish ancestors, you know what happened in Ireland?
Sure.
Potato famine. There was also crop failures in continental Europe during that time. So that's part of the motivation. In the German-speaking parts of Europe, there was also a wave of anti-government protests called the Revolutions of 1848. Many of them were actually in 1848, but there was this whole period of, we don't like what the prince is doing. This isn't what we expected. things are not going well. We want to be a republic. So part of this is as news that the United States is still hanging on as a country after 1789, right? So like 50 years in, this idea of a republic is still kind of working. Haiti is also a republic by this time. And this idea of representative governments has trickled into the monarchies of Europe. A bunch of educated, especially urban people are saying, yeah, we want this too. They stand up or lay down, depending on where they're protesting, and they stage these kind of upper middle class intellectual revolutions. And almost everywhere, so they happen in Frankfurt, they happen in Prague, Vienna has one, there's several in France. I think Budapest also has them, all over the place. And pretty much everywhere, they're either crushed by military force or they fizzle out because these intellectuals are idealists, but they've never had to run a government. So, you know, it's one thing to say, I want to be free. It's another thing to write a constitution and figure out how you're going to raise taxes and that kind of thing. So in the wake of these revolutions, in the early 1850s, you see this huge spike up of these people who tried to revolt. It didn't work. They are probably now being repressed. In some places, there was very clear political censorship. And they got the heck out of Dodge to escape that. That's that first circle. The second circle, in the mid 1860s to 1870s, that's, you can blame Bismarck. The Chancellor of Prussia, who unified these different German states through a series of 3 short wars, which he provoked. His goal was to unify Central Europe so that Central Europe could compete with basically Britain, economically and politically. And so these 3 wars of unification meant that on all sides, men were being drafted to serve in the war. It was mandatory in any land controlled by Prussia, which increasingly became the whole area. So that's a reason to leave. War in general, not real good for a satisfying home life. So that's this second circle. Yvonne asked about the big circle.
Yes, because that's when my great-grandparents came.
Yeah.
Yeah, they came from Brandenburg.
So the big circle is obviously when tons of people came, right?
Right.
And the happy reason for the big circle is that, and I'll come back to this, is that most shipping lines had transitioned from sailing ships to steam.
Oh,
And from wooden hulled ships to iron, and by 1880, steel. So travel was more reliable, it was safer, the boats were bigger, which means that the price could come down. And these ship lines also often provided food. procedures, right? Which makes the whole process a little easier and a little less risky. So that's one reason. And then kind of piled on top of that, after unifying the German lands politically, Prussian government, which was now the government of the German Empire, was working really hard to unify people's kind of mentalities. And so they cracked down on Catholics. They not so much on Jews at this point. That was earlier and later, but not at this point. But on Catholics and on people who identified as socialists, as left-leaning political figures. And so those people were being pretty forcibly repressed, and many of them fled. So this is a much bigger wave of Catholic immigration. There were Protestants as well. I thought side of the family was Methodist, married into the Presbyterians in Eastern Tennessee, and somehow the marriage survived. You know, but that's that big wave, and this big wave is also, and you see it a little bit earlier, is states and territories in what would become the Western United States actively recruiting.
Oh,
And I've got some examples of that in a little bit to show some of that recruitment, because it's fun, and some of the recruitment materials are in the state archives in Madison and are available online. They're kind of fun to peruse and look at.
what I found interesting with my family is that all the brothers and sisters seemed to come at the same time.
And this wave was much more likely, actually the 1870s wave as well, to be a more extended family kind of thing.
Because
With
my
my father's
great-grandmother's
family.
sisters and brothers were here, and my grandfather's sisters and brothers were all here, it seemed. Like the whole family just picked up and came.
Yeah, either all together
I don't
because
know.
it was cheaper and it was easier to travel with small children,
Okay.
or a kind of chain migration, right? You send a few people ahead, they get to northern Wisconsin and say, wow, you know, this kind of looks like
Boom.
northern Germany, and it does. We can make it here. And then others come after within, you know, a period of years or a couple generations sometimes. But there's a lot of this familial pull as well. And I think with the time I have left, that's a little bit of what I want to talk about, is the situation during these two big red circles. So 1860 to 1900-ish. And I guess the question I'll kind of throw out there for you is the ways, how do you think immigration is different during this time than it would have been in the 1700s? What changes? If you can imagine that.
Okay. Say that again.
Yeah, what do you think has changed between the 1740s or 1750s, which is when my Faust ancestors came over? What's changed between that time and, say, the 1880s?
Well, you just said it was safer.
Absolutely.
And they probably had an easier way of getting to port than they did in the earlier times.
Right.
And maybe it was in a way cheaper. And maybe the United States was advertising. I'm not sure.
You want to teach my class this fall? Exactly. By 1870s, Europe is railroaded. There is railroad. There are webs of railroads all over Europe. So travel is much easier and quicker and safer. Getting to port even. Shipbuilding is an industry that's impacted by mass production, which means it's cheaper to build ships, which means more people are building ships, and the price of sailing on a boat goes down. Absolutely. So the experience is going to be really quite, let me see if I can shrink this back down a little bit. So what you're seeing on the right, this chunk of a map, this is one of the maps that was actually provided to people who were thinking about immigrating from the ship companies, the boat companies, showing you, as Yvonne said, just how easy it was. There were rail lines that could get you from, if I can see this myself, from Frankfurt down here. Well, Frankfurt, you'd get on a river and come down here, right? But there are rail lines that could get you to the port of Bremen, the port of Hamburg. You could come down the river and get to Rotterdam. And then there are these predictable shipping calendars that tell you when the boat is going to leave. How convenient is that? The ports, there's still a lot of movement out of Rotterdam and Le Havre, but the ports, the major ports of immigrants have also shifted a little bit to Bremen or Bremerhaven and to Hamburg. And both of those cities have immigration museums that kind of like the opposite of Ellis Island, right? Shows you the experience of living. And I haven't looked at their online materials lately. Hamburg, the one in Hamburg was supposed to be putting a lot of their records online for people trying to do research. But these ports were increasingly policed because as the waves of immigrants go up, you know this, when immigration goes up, the people who are living in a place get a little anxious, get a little fearful. Who is this riffraff that doesn't even talk like us? That's coming from further away? And this is really, in the 1800s, is really the beginning of a traditional full-time police force. And it has a lot to do with controlling, regulating migration. And I'm not trying to take a political stance, it just happens to be the way it was historically. Well, if you know me well, maybe I am trying to take a political stance, but this is the historic reality. So there was a lot more policing and a lot more regulation. So for example, with Germany united, the German national government who were coming from, say, Warsaw or further east, those people had to buy a ticket that went all the way from the border of the German Empire. My hand was way here off the screen. All the way from the border of the German Empire, train ticket straight to Vettel Island in Hamburg. Vettel Island was an island in the middle of the Elbe River. That's where you're going to go. It's turned into a migration center by a wealthy investor by the name of Ballin. And he created this Ballinstadt, which was kind of this, supposed to be this utopian safe place where these naive rural migrants wouldn't get exploited by the dangers of the big city, you know, wouldn't drink away their their boat fare. But it was also on an island in the middle of the river, right? So the people in the city didn't have to worry about these. Until their boat left to go to America. So a lot more regulation. And on the American side, there was also an increasing amount of regulation. For the most part, the individual states controlled migration and naturalization, becoming a citizen, until the 1880s, 1890s. And that's really when the federal government said, numbers are getting big enough here that there needs to be one central system.
Got the phone calls from last night.
Say again? Oh, is he? I mean, oh, maybe he's talking to somebody else.
Can you mute yourself, Bruce?
Oh, maybe I can mute. How do I do that?
If you do the click on participants. There we go.
Okay. Now go back. There we go.
There we are.
Hear me again?
Yep.
Back, yeah. So a lot more regulation and an expectation of sponsorship, so that somebody already in the United States would vouch for you financially. So you're not going to be a drag on the welfare system, basically. Down here. Oh, I skipped one. There. And this is the part, this is so cool. Well, I don't know if it's cool or not, but it's interesting. It's so fascinating. And it's in this time period, 1880s, 1890s, even a little earlier, that there's this whole industry around immigration. I mentioned the need to buy through tickets, to buy a ticket that went the whole way from, you know, your hometown, Warsaw, all the way to Kiel, Wisconsin. Or maybe there's a Warsaw, Wisconsin, I don't know. There probably is, right?
Right.
So you bought this one ticket that went the whole way. And you knew what boat you were going to get on. You knew you were going to be fed on the boat. And so with this industry and more shipping lines, there were paid recruiters, sometimes from the shipping lines. So Hapag Hapag-Lloyd were some of the big ones. Sometimes, and you see there on the lower left, the Wisconsin Central Railroad
Oh,
produced marketing material. And that's two sides of like a bookmark kind of flyer thing that was produced by an agent in Colby, Wisconsin. Apparently had a bunch of land at his disposal and was working with the Wisconsin Central Railroad to make money, to settle farmers. And so this is promotional material. And this is like, the free pens that you get at State Farm or whatever it is. These recruiters, marketers hired writers, professional writers, to write travel guides, like AAA triptychs, I guess, that were written then. You see the one in the middle, that gray square, is written in German. Literally says Wisconsin is the title. And then under it says Bevölkerung, Boden, something or other, Beschaffenheit und Klima. So population, the land, fertility, and the climate of northern Wisconsin. And this is a summary book, so you knew what you were getting into. And I've got some examples from another one on the next slide that I'll show you in just a minute, but there's a whole slew of these. And there are a bunch of them that have been scanned in on the Wisconsin Historical Society's website. This is one of their kind of early collections, were these guidebooks, Welcome to Wisconsin, in whatever language you need. There was also a budding industry in adventure novels. Life in the Wild West of the United States. And that kind of advertising appealed to people who thought Europe was just too crowded and too polluted and too industrialized. And it was polluted. And they were looking for this kind of back to nature, romantic experience. Karl May was one of the most famous novelists in the German-speaking world of these kind of novels. And he wrote this whole series. I've taught with a couple of them. He wrote this whole series of books about a German immigrant who comes to the United States and departs for places out west from St. Louis, and he becomes blood brothers with one of the Native American Indians and gets the Indian name Old Shatterhand. And Old Shatterhand and his Native American buddy, they art smart and outshoot and out everything. The Yankees, the British, and are buddies with all of the Native American tribes, except the evil ones, who are usually evil because they've been given fire water, so liquor, by the Yankees. It's a really interesting set of novels because you see Karl May like raising up the position of Germans, and this fascination, this love of back to nature. And that existed in German culture. Everybody older than me has read Karl May books in German.
Is that
Almost
part of
everybody.
why the Germans you see are still so interested kind of in the Southwest of the United States?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And they do, there are reenactment clubs that spend their summers, very controversial these days, but they spend their summers living as they think perhaps Native American Indians might have lived if they had lived in, Bavaria. But there's this fascination with that persists. And Karl May wrote all these books before he ever went to the United States.
Oh my gosh.
So he was using these travel guides to describe, you know, how the railroads were built across the Rockies, blah, 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 you know, and the lazy workers. But it's this whole marketing industry. And then there were, I think, what we think of as sort of informal recruitment, right? People writing letters home. And this is another collection. There's several collections of these at the Historical Society. And I might have examples of that. But this whole industry, specific hotels for people migrating. One there in the lower right is one of these hotels in Rotterdam. And between the hotel and the city government, there's an exchange of letters, and the shipping company who has sponsored the hotel. And the shipping company says to the mayor's office, don't worry, this hotel, yes, it's a big place, but don't worry, we can, and this is literal, we can quarantine up to 600 migrants. So if you're worried, coming through Rotterdam are bringing disease, not to worry. We sequester them here. 600 people in a building. It doesn't look like that big a building, but we can sequester them here and move them along. So you can see, just like Yvonne said, it's totally different experience at this point in time. Okay, you still with me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
I'm almost done, but I want to share with you some of these sources. So let me see if I can make this bigger. So this is another one of these handbooks, one of these guidebooks, the Immigrant's Handbook and Guide to Wisconsin, comprising information respecting agriculture and manufacturing employment, wages, climate, population, a sketch of Milwaukee, the Queen City of the Lakes, its rise and progress, business and population, list of public officers, with a full, accurate table of statistical information of Milwaukee and other ports on Lake Michigan, and also more, a table of travel routes from New York, Boston, et cetera, to Milwaukee, Racine, Kenosha, I think Sheboygan too, and a list of steamboats and other general information. And this is a pretty early one, 1851, published in Milwaukee. Wisconsin is actively recruiting. Prior to statehood, Wisconsin was actively recruiting to get enough population to become a state. And it's still recruiting to get us in Congress. The reasons. And then I've given you there 3 excerpts from this book. And I'll just read them. The first excerpt up at the top talks about the allure of New York City. Statue of Liberty, and Samuel Freeman, the author, is saying, watch out, New York is a dangerous place, and I strongly advise the immigrant, after you have spent a day or two inspecting the city of New York, like go see the sights, spend some time on Broadway or whatever you do, lose no time in quitting that place. Get the heck out of there before it takes all your money from you. Lose no time in quitting New York City while you still have the means of doing so. It will only benefit you to get out of New York City. Facilities for traveling through the United States are cheap and good, no worry about that. I recommend you take advantage of this cheap travel by steamboat. and by railroad especially, and get out of the city. They start daily. You can get out as quick as you can. It will be the most profitable way of laying the foundation for your future happiness. Stay in New York, you're doomed. Lose no time. And that section goes on and says very specifically, here's where you should go to get your railroad ticket. Don't go here, because these guys will scam you. Maybe Samuel Freeman was getting a kickback from a particular railroad company. And then the middle quote is part of this pulling you into Wisconsin. You know, why Wisconsin? Why not Ohio? Why not Illinois? Why not Michigan? Because in all parts of this new state of Wisconsin, and maybe immigrants had never even heard this word before, it's such a new state, a laborer can get the fullest amount of wages, you get paid a bunch, you can live cheap, and meet few temptations to spend your money. There's not much gambling, there are not many prostitutes, houses of ill repute, right? There's enabled in everything to keep your expenses down. They're not the taxes of back east. This applies especially to laborers who are employed in public works, so building railroads, building roads, that kind of thing. You are moderately temperate, commonly careful. If you have an ounce of common sense, you can work for a few years building the railroads or the roads and end up with tons of money. It's the American dream. And then the third quote is, I think what most of us who live in Wisconsin kind of think about is the good soil, right? The good farmland, the rich farmland, breadbasket. And this is like an 100-page, 150-page book that goes into this level of detail all along the way. Okay, I'm a geek. I happen to find it a fascinating read.
I think what's really about that one, it says that you become an owner of the farm. You know, that's got to have been a real
Exactly.
to those people, especially.
Yeah. And then you can decide what you want to do with it, right?
Yeah.
You choose what you're going to grow on it. It's all in your power. Franz Holzelhuber, who wrote a whole bunch of letters home, he also was something of an artist and was commissioned at various points to sketch and paint illustrations that were sometimes postcards that people would send back to the old country, or sometimes were illustrations in these guidebooks. And let me see if I can make this bigger too. So these are 4 of his illustrations.
Those are some really nice sized buildings on those farms, aren't they? That's now Wisconsin.
Yeah. So maybe a little advertising here, right? Schultz's farm near Stevens Point is the lower right. Like,
Yeah.
darn, you know, I want to go meet the Schultzes. They've got it made.
Wow.
Like a 3-story house.
Yes. Oh my. And what are those? All those.
Even the sketch on the boat.
Gorgeous, isn't it?
Sunday afternoon at sea. Where's the slop bucket? Right? Where's the salt encrusted on the, how is everybody's clothes so clean? They're wearing their Sunday best and it's spotless, right? This is clearly recruitment. Or it's just, you know, you're trying to paint a good picture for the folks back home. You're not going to talk about the bad stuff.
You think that
It goes a long way in recruiting migrants. Yeah, go ahead.
That deck, I mean, isn't that perfect? Isn't that nice and clean?
Yeah.
I bet it never looked that well even when it was new.
And even the steamboat there. That's on the Fox River. Gee, that must be one ginormous river. And what that's showing on the tree, I had to look this up because I wasn't sure either. That's a mailbox.
Yes.
So the steamboat could pull in if there was mail to deposit to that region and just leave it there in the little mailbox on the tree. So this is all advertising. And you can kind of hear in the background, this is the streets paved with gold, right? And Wisconsin's streets weren't paved with gold, but geez, you know, it looks like a stone house there on the Schultz's farm. Pretty nice. Enclosed steamship travel. How good does it get? Up on the top, you see steamships coming down Lake Michigan. You see the North Point Lighthouse up there. And this Ludeman's on the Lake was both a farm and almost country town where you could get out of the city of Milwaukee and go up to Ludeman's for a Sunday dinner. So, you know, very respectable and civilized. This is not in the big woods. And we already talked about this really, the faster, easier travel. And I just have two examples there to show you. So Franz Holzenhuber, he sailed back and forth a few times, and one of the ships that we know he sailed on was the Tuisco, which was this 3-masted sailing ship in the upper right. It carried maximum capacity was 335 passengers. I don't know who was counting that. I don't know if that includes children, who knows? It's a wooden sailing ship, probably at this time wood reinforced with iron, but I'm not sure. 20 years later, 70s, the boats were more like, this is the SS Frisia. It was a hybrid, hybrid sail and steam. Could, you know, save energy when the wind is good, but you could stay on schedule by converting to a steam engine. It carried 820 passengers. And I'll let you do the math. If there were 90 people in the first class cabins, had access to this area up here, and 130 people in the second class. I don't know if you can see the pointer.
Yes.
Cursor, that's here. Do your quick math. How many people were in third class?
600.
Yeah. Right, and third class looked like this. I mean, pretty crowded, but you got your food supplied. You were in an iron bed. You had a mattress.
Oh,
And you had a predictable, it's kind of like planes today, right? There's like 12 first class seats, and then there's 35 business class, and then 600 of us back in steerage. And I think on the Frisia, I think there was something like 120 or 130 crew in the crew.
that must have really been a mess in that room, down there when somebody got sick.
Oh my gosh, yeah, yeah. It did have washroom facilities, shared common washroom facilities, but yeah, I mean, for COVID-19 era travel, no thank you. I'm gonna jump over this. This is just more travel. I think Philip had one last question for me. If you're still with me, I know I'm going long on time. Do today.
Oh, no, bro, this is great.
So what was the reception like? Were these German-speaking immigrants, were they welcome? To what extent? Were they herzlich willkommen? Were they welcome with open arms? And the answer, like so many things, is my favorite German word, jein, which is the best parenting word ever because it means yes and no at the same time. So yes, on the one hand, there was a lot of welcoming, but also there was considerable fear. So for example, in the 1700s already, in these British colonies, there was real concern that these people, and this is a quote, with swarthy complexions, like me, right? Dark haired, threaten the whiteness of the colonies. And whiteness meant Britishness. A kind of fear that the further away from the British Isles people came from, we don't know. And in the 1700s, people who are still living under princes and feudalism, maybe they're not ready to be citizens of an American republic. Maybe they stick to themselves too much. Oktoberfest. They're preserving their own traditions. They're supposed to be celebrating the 4th of July, and instead they're celebrating Oktoberfest or whatever it is. But on the other hand, Benjamin Franklin wrote about this problem a fair bit. He kind of went back and forth on what he thought. So you can quote him as being anti-immigrant, or you can quote him as being pro-immigrant. He said of the Germans, despite all these problems, they do have their virtues. They are hardworking, industrious, and frugal. And he's comparing his mind to the Irish. Or more importantly, to the Catholic. So it's this both and, right? Also during this time period, if you can see, there's a graph there. Hessian mercenaries. So Hessian soldiers on both sides of the American Revolution. British Crown hired, I think, like 5,000-ish Hessian mercenaries to fight the British side in the American Revolution. And obviously, some of my Faust ancestors fought on the American side in the American Revolution. So after the Revolutionary War, there were more than 5,000 Herson missionaries. I'm just doing the math there. There were a ton more. There were like 25,000. Some 5,000 of them stayed in the country they had just been fighting against. They just settled because they were industrious and frugal and probably saw more opportunity there. So it's this both and, right? You've done this job that's distasteful. You've got cousins here, maybe who you fought against. Stick around. And this kind of both and continues through the 1800s. In terms of the economy, there's a real drive to pull immigrants in, because there's a whole industry that depends on selling the United States to them. On the other hand, there's this ongoing tension between British, Scotch Americans on the East Coast, Yankees, and anybody who speaks anything other than British English, which maybe is German or Polish or Swabian or Bavarian or Yiddish, but it's clearly not English. So there's some tension there. On the other hand, in the 1800s, German universities are the top notch in terms of scientific discoveries. Chemistry, biology, physics. Their industry and frugality is exemplary, right? So for a country that's trying to build its reputation, we want these smart, industrious people. We especially want them in the German Triangle. Since Milwaukee, St. Louis, this region that is pretty familiar to us is very heavily German. And so what happens in the 1800s is that Americans start to distinguish between Western European Germans and Jews, they're the good kind, and Eastern. So Poles, Germans in Eastern Europe, Russians, Russian Jews, Latvian, Lithuania, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the ones that are so different, that are more likely to be more conservative in their traditions and religious practices. They become the other. The educated, university-bound Western European Germans and Jews, they're fine. This other group is less fine. And even in places like Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, there was that discrimination. And so those Eastern Europeans go to places like Pittsburgh. So there's forever, and you know this from today, right? There's this tension. And that tension builds really into World War I, which is where German migrants, immigrants, even second and third and fourth generation are told to prove their loyalty to the United States. Because writing letters to the cousins back home, you could be giving them information to help the war effort over there. Sending care packages, your cousin, the war widow, that's the enemy. And that becomes illegal during World War I. Those kind of connections, which is why so many of us lost connections to those ancestors ancestors if we had them wherever they were in Europe. World War I has a lot to do with it. So what do you do as a German American? Assimilate. So you stop speaking German to your kids. So my father, who would be 80, 82 this year, he heard German from his grandparents, never learned it. A farm in Michigan, his parents spoke German, he never learned it, right? That's this assimilation. Responses included a lot of self-help organizations through the churches and also through non-religious organizations like the gymnastics clubs. They were called Turnvereine. That were in almost every even smaller town. These places to send your young men, your teenage boys, so they weren't out on the streets doing whatever teenage boys do out on the streets.
So that's where Milwaukee got their Turner Hall from.
Exactly, Turner Hall, yeah. And a lot of towns in Wisconsin still have a Turner Hall. Coming from Pittsburgh, where there was a Turner Dairy, I thought it had something to do with that. Not at all. It had to do with these health clubs, right? The YMCA comes out of the same kind of mentality. And then there was another one that I don't know anything about, but it still exists to this day. And so I'm asking it to you all to see if you've ever heard of it. This Order of Herman's Sons, which is a benevolent organization that still exists, and it was originally founded to help new immigrants assimilate and get along without having to turn to the state, because that gives other immigrants a bad reputation. Charges the state. But I don't know, have any of you ever heard of that?
I haven't.
No.
It apparently is flourishing in California to this day. It's like a German heritage organization.
I grew up in California. I'll have to ask my parents if they know anything about it.
Yeah, yeah, they've got cool pins like with the beach on there and everything.
Yeah, we had a lot of German farmers by us, so I'll have to ask.
Yeah, you should ask. And then, yeah, the other response, you know this, right? This is kind of that traditional American myth. The American story is succeed, buckle down and get the job done. That's how you respond. And then the fourth, I should have put this not last because it's a kind of a down note. One way to respond is to let or help a different group of people become the other. And that is as much a part of the American story as the other three. That's what people have always done when they came to this continent, is a combination of these four things. And the German Americans are no different. And that's what I got for you.
Very
Thank
great.
you for sticking with me. I think it's a really interesting history to talk about. And if you can like plug family connections in there, I just think it's cool. You know, why would you teach the names of dead presidents if you can talk about ordinary people? So thank you very much. And
That was
if you have
very nice.
questions or
Thank you very
comments-
much.
Yeah,
you.
I think,
Thank
can
you.
I unshare my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us.